again for making it today. So this is your last webinar, and it's about your students and how to improve your students' language practice outside the classroom. So let's move to this slide. This is myself. My name is Anna Malakan. I was the academic manager at EF London this summer. I'm currently studying applied linguistics in London. I'm doing my master's degree. Before that, I did my undergraduate degree in TESOL and modern languages. And I also have Trinity certificate in TESOL and Trinity diploma in TESOL that I completed last year. So that's about me. Here you can see our EF school language campus in London. It's one of the many that we have around the world. Can you see the green arrow? Is it working? Yeah. Okay, it says, okay, yep, good. So let's move to the next slide. Okay, here is the agenda, the outline for this presentation, for this webinar. So speaker info, you've just seen reasons to encourage language practice outside the classroom, extensive reading, some practical ideas, listening and some practical ideas, writing some practical ideas for you that you could use in the classroom or outside the classroom. Same goes for speaking. Then there will be a poll question. Just bear in mind that there is not going to be a wrong or right question, but I'll remind it later again. Then I'll mention a little bit something about projects and themed weeks, what you could do with your students. I'll also talk about some issues in regards to this topic. Also a little bit about e-safety, safety online. Then I'll summarize the previous slides. Then you'll have some time for questions and answers. Then you'll also see some suggested readings if you're interested in doing a little bit more of research on this topic. And then it's the last slide, but it is very important that you follow the link to prove your attendance, in which you'll also have to answer a question related to this webinar. Okay, let's move to some reasons why we should encourage students to practice the language outside the classroom. So first of all, it's all about students, and when we encourage them to speak outside the classroom, we give them ownership of their learning and of their learning progress. So in other words, we can also say they become more responsible for their learning. They can decide for themselves how and when and what exactly they want to learn, even if it is not the formal classroom setting, but the so-called informal, natural, not instructed learning and teaching context. Then it can also be fun because it is related to students' interests, because they do it outside the class time, and it can just be focused more on them and more personalized. So it leads to funnier activities, or just to being more satisfied when students use the language outside of the class and in the ways they would want to use it themselves. It's also real practice, real language practice. So whenever students use the language outside the classroom, it is actually real, it is not controlled. Usually, it's used for, so to say, fluency of the language and not necessary accuracy of the language. So sometimes, we or students might make more some slips or mistakes. It might be not completely accurate, but it is very good for fluency and for developing fluency. Um, then another reason why we should encourage speaking outside the classroom or using language in general outside the classroom is because students also develop different competencies. There is research, academic research done, and it suggests that we all human beings have possess, so to say, or have different competences within us. And some of them are, as you can see here on the slide, is communicative competence. It means that we are able to communicate, to listen, and to respond. There is a linguistic competence, which means we can accurately use a certain language, accurate grammatical form or syntactical forms as well. Or socio-cultural competence, it means we are not only able to, for example, use correct grammar, but we know who we are speaking to, and we understand different social relationships of people we speak to. So, for example, I would speak to my young brother in a different manner than I would speak to my tutor at university, for example. And being aware of these differences means that we are socio-cultural competent when we communicate. And using language outside the classroom leads to development of all these competences, but I do think it also quite important that it leads to social cultural competence, because any interaction is usually happens in a social cultural context. Moving to the next slide, there are some more reasons why it is beneficial to the students to use the language outside the classroom. So again, in the classroom, students contribute to learning, but they also, when they use or when they're encouraged to use the language outside the classroom, they also contribute actively and personally contribute to their learning outside the classroom. So it means we sort of take learning from the inside to the real world and beyond the classroom. So in other words, learning does not stop in the classroom, within classroom, but it goes further and it becomes also learning outside classroom. And it is important to mention that we do spend more time outside the classroom and not in English classes. Overall, also students succeed, and teachers and students can there are different ways to check the progress. I'll mention it later. And if students see their success, I will also mention later that it is not always visible on, so to say, for example, the first day students use language somewhere outside the classroom, but eventually they arrive to the point where they can see that they succeed, and it leads to motivation of the students as well. There is also research done on these two topics, success and motivation, and it's going to be mentioned in the last slide on the reading list. Reflective learning. So when we encourage students to use the language outside the classroom, it is also very important for the teachers to realize that we need to make sure we guide the students even when learning takes place outside the classroom and the teacher is physically not there and not present. We still need to make sure that we somehow reflect, or we help students reflect on their learning. it is our responsibility to make sure this happens, and you'll see in next slides some suggestions how you could maybe do that. And also it is possible to uh, encourage students to use language skills outside the classroom through different skills, receptive and productive, by developing these skills not only in the classroom, and you'll see it in the next slides. So let's move to the next slide. So I mentioned 4 different skills, and I'm going to talk about extensive reading. Extensive reading means means reading for pleasure. Quite often in classes we have no time to do some extensive reading for pleasure, because very often we do reading to train students to pass exams, external exams or internal tests, or we follow course books that quite often focus on general comprehension of text and detailed comprehension of text. um, However, we should encourage students to read for pleasure. Again, if we do that, students will be responsible for their own learning, because they can decide for themselves what they want to read, why they want to read something, and they might even do, and quite often they'll do some online research about the books or any other tools that they can use for reading, and it all means they're cognitively involved in their learning process. So again, it leads to student motivation, and if students are motivated, they also eventually become good language learners, and they can succeed during their language learning journey. Again, we have to monitor and guide students' learning, even if learning takes place outside the classroom. And as I said before, learning does take place outside the classroom as well as inside classroom when we are there. So here are some practical ideas for extensive reading and how you could integrate these into your classroom or perhaps beyond the classroom. So I would like to start here from actually these 2 points from the end. So you can use graded readers, original books, comics, magazines, newspapers, or leafletters. So this bit here, it's basically anything that you can find in hard copies that students can read. You can use school library, or students can buy some things online, some books online, or nowadays we can also use different online resources. We are very lucky they are there and quite often accessible to everyone. I can see in the chat window many questions. So Liz is asking something. Could you write down your questions and ask the questions at the end of the session when it's time for questions and answers? Thank you. So online resources, yeah. Here are also some examples for online resources that you could use with your students. You can either introduce them in your classes, you can use them for some homework. These are the websites related to books, to films, to lifestyle in general. This BBC is a news website. Creative blog is also related to lifestyle and news in general, but very interactive. Some pictures of the websites here as well. So when we encourage students to read, we can ask them to read anything they like for pleasure, be it, for example, a book review on this website on Goodreads or something else. But we can encourage them to write diaries or some reports. It's completely up to you and to your judgment, because you know your teaching setting and also your students better, whether you do it every lesson, the first 5 minutes of the lesson, or whether you do it once a week. but a few times per week, it's completely up to you. But important is that you encourage students to reflect on what they do with all these things outside the classroom. Your students might be very creative, where you just ask them to write diaries, but sometimes you need some prompt questions for them to be able to write diaries or some reports. It could be something, mention some things you like, you didn't like about the book, why, or would you recommend this book for someone else, why, or what happened in the first 2 or 3 chapters, anything. So you might consider using some prompt questions. Then booking. So at your school, you can have something like a booking corner or a booking corner. So you would encourage your students to swap books, or you would encourage your students to bring some books to school and leave them in this sort of booking corner for other students. So basically, you would circulate books within your school community, or your students, or even more students from other classes could be involved in bookings. And quite often you could also encourage students to write some small review cards. It's up to you how you'd like to do that, but for example, I would do something like write 3 things you liked about the book and 3 things you didn't like about the book, and perhaps rate the book from 1 to 5, or draw stars or hearts or something. And you would also leave these reviews for books next to the books in your booking corner, and other students could come, check the review and take the book and bring their books and leave them there. And it's quite helpful because these parents could also see what is happening and how kids or students in general learn and are encouraged to learn beyond the classroom and beyond the curriculum. You could also organize you could also organize some reading clubs. Again, it's up to you and up to the setting where you are teaching, but it is possible to organize some reading clubs where some students or all of your students would meet every now and then uh, to discuss books, to make some research what they'd like to read next, to work on a sort of a reading list for the next 2 or 3 months, sort of bucket list for reading. And it all encourages students again to be cognitively involved and in their own learning, and to be reflective and to understand why they're doing what they're doing. It does lead to um, becoming a good language learner. So let's move to the next slide. We can also encourage students to use language outside the classroom uh, through listening. So again, listening can be relevant to the students. It So the students again decide themselves what they want to listen to, what they're interested in. So again, it can be very personalized and related to their topics of interest. Uh, when they listen to whatever they decide to listen to, it exposes students to different accents. It is quite helpful to expose students to different accents, be it native or non-native accents. So the exposure to the variety is there as well. In general, we can watch films, TV series, podcasts on radio, or you could upload podcasts also on Android or Apple phones. Um, Students can listen to their favorite songs or to songs in general. And there are also TV channels. I think nowadays we all have TV at home, and quite often we have international TV where we have thousand channels, and it is possible to find something like BBC or CNN or any other news channels on actual TV. And if not, things like Netflix or Amazon Prime can be accessed online, and you can watch TV series and films and podcasts are there as well. YouTube is also there, quite helpful to for many different things, even for watching short videos how to do anything, how to make a soup, or how, and it can be done in English as well. That website quite helpful uh, to to develop students' knowledge on certain topics they're interested in. There are some videos that are quite long, but there are also TED for education. They have quite short videos, very easy to understand. It can all be found online. Let's move to the next slide. So here are some practical ideas what you could do with the things that I've just mentioned before. So you could, for example, again, because we want students to reflect on their learning and also sort of to guide them through their learning process, even if learning takes place outside the classroom. We could monitor them. For example, if you introduce students to different things they can do. They could vote what they would like to do. For example, you could assign different channels if you know they can access these channels. Um, and let's say for 1 week they watch these channels and they watch the news. And then at the end of the week, but it doesn't have to be at the end of the week, it can be in 2 weeks or it can be in 2 or 3 English lessons. So again, it's really up to your teaching context. You can ask the students to present things they have seen, for example, in the news, or you could ask them to even perform some things, perhaps if you know it's something they would like doing, you could ask them to perform it. It can be again done in classes or in after school clubs if for some reason you don't think it's a good idea to do it in class because you might have to follow a class curriculum, so it can be difficult. So in general, you have to choose time that works for you and your students. You can also organize film viewings. It means you can have something like film clubs at school, or you can just have every Thursday during your lunch break, you watch a film, and before that, students could vote what films they'd like to watch and put it in the, for example, in the box with their suggestions, for example. Or you could even organize a proper school trip to the cinema every now and then if it's something that would work in your teaching context, where you take them to the cinema and they watch films in English if it is something that is possible to do in the places where you teach. And then you have also film clubs. It can be film clubs as something that is organized, something like a film society, film clubs that students attend every week, every second week, where they discuss films, but it or present films or rate films. You could also have some maybe fun activities included there, something like let's sell popcorn for the film viewing evening or for film viewing during lunchtime. Let's even prepare tickets for the films. So in that way, students are encouraged to use the English language. They also communicate with each other and they reflect on what they're doing. And again, it can be very personal and related to their interests. So just something, some ideas. I'm reading some questions, but let's leave them for the for a little bit later. Okay, let's move to the next slide. So, okay, here is a poll question. There is no right or wrong answer. I just would like to know how, in your teaching context, how do you think what is the best way to sort of for students and for you to reflect on students' language? Don't write it in the chat window, please, but just use the poll. Choose A, B, or C. Um, Not the chat window. Mm-hmm. Okay, let's do 3 more seconds and then move to a different slide. Oh, nice. So it's like uh, clubs of interests or spend some time in class occasionally. Yeah, it's very different. So I see, guys, I can see you writing it in the chat windows. Could you please, yeah, use the poll. Good. Okay, let's move to the next slide. Okay, we can also encourage students to write I'm sorry, I'm looking at the slides. Okay, that's here. Thank you, Marina. You can also encourage students to use their language skills outside the classroom by writing. Even if you don't do writing in your classes, it's possible to do it outside the class time. So important is that you um, give students some reasons why they should write, and in other words, you just have to give them some opportunities to practice writing outside the classroom. And some would say, but they write some bits outside the classroom, but really they make mistakes, we cannot correct it, and it's quite often wrong and not correct. It might be true, but quite often we don't have to focus on the form. And as long as students practice writing in English and they're cognitively involved in some information, and they think, okay, how do I say this, how do I write that, it's quite enough to develop their language skills. So focus on the form is not always necessary. Let's move to some practical ideas here. So, practical ideas for writing. You can encourage your students to do some online research, or you can do it with them together. It depends on your students and you and your teaching context. But you can find some writing competitions where they enter competitions where they have to produce a short story. Flash fiction means just short mini stories. And there are many, many, many that you can find on Google. You don't have to have C2 level of English, and there are all different sorts of writing competitions in different countries. So it's possible. I've just found one for the UK, but just one picture. But there are many, many more. It's something for you to consider. Then you can also encourage students to write a blog or a journal. There are again many of blog and journal writing platforms that you can find online, but these are quite famous. And Medium, I mean, WordPress is a little bit older, but Medium is a nice platform because you've seen it before. There are some news that students can read, so they can read for pleasure, i.e. extensive reading, but they can also write there, be it their own blog or just a comment, a reply to something they feel they really want to reply to, because you can find different topics on this website. So this is quite helpful because you can do many things there. Um, then you as a teacher could also set up some discussion groups on topics that are relevant to students, and you could also use some social media like Padlet or Remind or Evernote or any other social media. But you can encourage students to discuss things that you have covered inside the classroom, and they can work further outside the classroom on the things that's been introduced to them before. So again, in this way, they sort of their learning does not stop in the classroom, but it goes beyond the classroom walls, and you actively encourage them to take that learning outside the classroom by discussing things that have already been previously mentioned, so they can reuse and recycle their language there as well in natural context. You can use Class Wiki. This is Class Wiki, where students themselves prepare a class, and they can upload the link, and they can teach other students about anything they would like to teach. So basically, it's like a flipped classroom or double flipped classroom. I'm not sure about the correct terminology, but students double flipped classroom. But students can use this platform where they prepare a lesson. They can make videos. They can have a lesson plan there, where they can teach then other students. You also have fun fiction. So this is one website, but you can find many more online. Fun fiction is basically the process where students write or rewrite stories or films that have been on the market before. So they use characters that we know, so like Hermione or Hobbit from Harry Potter, from Lord of the Rings, or any other famous books and films. But they can create their own fiction using characters that we all know, and they can do it online. And there are many people who write fun fiction as well. So there is a big community, and again, it encourages students to write, but also to cognitively process the language and to actively decide for themselves what they do. And it is creative, so it is not just the reproduction of the language what they have heard in class, but it goes a little bit beyond. They don't solemnly repeat what they've done in class, but they create and recreate things for themselves. And for doing all this, you can also use some online tools to check writing. This is one app. I think you can access it on the laptop as well, produced by Cambridge. But there are many more apps on Google writing that you can find on Google. You could Google something like writing lab apps, and they will be there. And sometimes you can also get not just your writing corrected, but you can also get some feedback, some general feedback. At least I know when you use this app. Let's move to the next slide. So speaking in general is an integrated skill, and we use speaking every day, even when we are involved in listening or writing or reading. Quite often we do have to speak. So in general, it's very important to understand that we learn language. We don't live in the world alone. We are surrounded by people. We are surrounded by certain people, and we live in a certain culture, and we learn languages through social interaction, and it is also very culture dependent. It's important to know that we spend more time outside the classroom, and we do learn outside the classroom more than we learn inside the classroom. We also, when we are involved in social interaction, and we do socialize every day, we don't exist here on our own. We communicate our message, and quite often we have to, especially if it's not a student's mother tongue, we have to rephrase and reformulate things if we see, okay, I'm speaking to someone, but that person doesn't understand me. So I'll try to say it in a different way. I'll try to reformulate it. So we sort of co-construct the meaning as we speak. And again, it helps develop your speaking skills, but also it develops your communicative competence as well as social cultural competence, because every time we speak to someone, we understand our relationship to that person. So we do develop our social cultural competence as well. And it is productive language practice. So it's natural, it's productive, it's there, and we do it again for fluency rather than for accuracy. Um, then let's move to this slide. So here are some practical ideas that you can use. So in class, as I said, we spend more time outside the classroom, and quite often if you have 90 minutes or 2 hours classes, it can be not enough for practicing speaking skills. So students can learn language on language learning platforms. They can meet people there, and they can also talk to each other. So it's not just writing, it can start as chatting to each other, but eventually they can speak to each other, where they would use speaking skills. There are also there are also some online courses that students can join, not to directly learn the language, but to actually learn some anything that they're interested in, so like machine learning or philosophy courses in English. So for example, on this website, the courses are free, and they can they can attend courses online dependent on their interests, but it's going to be done in English. Okay, then this here. So there are also many apps, for example, like Smule apps. I'll come back to this one later. So like Smule app, it's an app where students, it's amazing because you upload it on your phone, and then you can sync with students or with people from any other countries together, and you can record your songs and upload them there. And so it is online, but you get to speak and to interact and to even, so to say, network with other people from all over the world. It opens you the doors to the outer world. So it's something that can be also done outside the classroom. Then again, you can organize some speaking clubs and debate clubs dependent on your teaching context. And the last one, but it's a very important one, it's collaboration with other schools worldwide. You can have Skype calls. You can share your cultural experience with, as it says here, other schools worldwide. You might have some school contacts already at your school, or we also have some schools that would like to collaborate with other schools worldwide. So we open doors through education, and it is possible to do so. So if you're interested in that, you can send us an email. I'll put an email in the chat window later. You can also have themed weeks or projects. So usually it's important that not only you have some projects where you present, but you also have audience. So students who present, they know they're being heard and they're being watched, and it's not all done in, so to say, one direction, but there is opinion exchange, opinion presentation. So it's quite good to have audience. You can, in general, also consider something like stage performance based on books, on films they have seen, they have read, if you think it's something your students would like to do. And you can have school events, not necessarily related to English tea or royal family, but it can be something more related to students, something about sports or travel events, but it can be done in English. And what is nice that if it's like a big event that you have on Friday afternoon or perhaps Thursday afternoon or any other day, that some students organize some bits, for example, like teaching how to do karate, and they would have like a workshop in one classroom. They would have a workshop on that, and any visitors, any audience uh, could go to one classroom or even outside and do that workshop, while in the other classroom you have something like karate costume making, and then someone else can go and visit that, so to say, station. So students are engaged, and there is audience as well, and it's very, very informative, and you don't have the feeling that it is all about formal learning. It's actually an event, and it's quite nice. um, let's move to the next slide. So as you've seen, you can use many online tools, but it's important that we just bear in mind we are safe online, and usually it is very safe to use uh, Padlet and any other apps, Mule or Write and Improve. We do have to understand that it's good not to share your personal information. We should know that we can find disturbing graphics. However, these can be avoided, and especially if parents are informed that students are encouraged to use different tools and different platforms online, parents can always use parental control, so that certain websites are not accessible for the students. So in general, it is quite safe to use anything that is online. Let's move to the next slide. Okay, some issues. So uh, of course, it is never black or white, and there are some issues with the previous slides. So sometimes we don't have enough time in our formal English classes because we have to follow a curriculum, or we have to make sure students pass the exams at the end of the course, and there is no time to do anything else, or we just don't get enough paid to stay and do some after school clubs. Some materials can be difficult to find, but maybe not really, because some, yes, but I think we are quite good to have enough accessible materials online, or we can also buy films and books online and have them sent to school libraries, for example. Some students might not be engaged, or they might think, we are not learning much. This is all normal. It can never all be perfect, and everyone is different. So we just need to, I think, acknowledge these facts, that this is there, this is something that can happen, but it should not stop you from trying to use, Smule in your classes or outside your classes, because in general there is research that shows that actually it does help students to become better language learners, and it does help motivate them, even though, yes, of course, sometimes we might encounter some issues, but it is normal. So this is the summary. If you just take a few seconds to read these quotes by Alice, who is a linguist. Um, so as you can see, again, he reinforces everything that has been said before. It is quite important to make sure the opportunities are there for students to use the language outside the classroom. Um, and we teachers can provide resources, um, and we can help students learn outside the classroom. Um, It's true, students benefit from language use outside the classroom. We develop skills and competences outside the classroom as well. We help students in their learning journey by monitoring them or making them reflect on what they have done, also by encouraging them to work on their own and to do their own personal research on topics that they're interested in. And issues, we have seen some, but we also know that it's something we can live with, and it is possible to deal with these issues. Let's move to questions here. If you have any, you could type some in the chat window. Um, okay, thank you. Yeah, I can see. Thank you very much as well for coming. Don't leave the chat because you have um, to to use the attendance link. Games outside the classroom. Someone said. I would say something here very quickly. Well, you could use some board games or card games. It can be done in class, in clubs, or outside the clubs, or they can also talk to people online and play games online. It's a different area where students also can learn a language, so it is possible. Um, Here is the reading list. There is also something on games and fan fiction, so it's something you might be interested in doing your personal research a little bit more in depth. And the last one is very important. So here is the link that you should be able to open. Um, and once you have opened the link, please answer this question here, but don't write your answers in the chat box, in the chat window. Just use the link that Marina just sent in the chat window. I cannot say if it's A or B or C. This is why it's a question. But please do follow the link, answer the question, because in that way we can see that you have attended the final webinar. And then congratulations to you all. Thank you for coming. And you'll be also able to receive your certificates in a due time. The limited choice, someone is asking. It really is dependent on your students, on their age, I would say. But I would have some limitations, maybe more than 2 or 3, but I would not tell them do whatever you like, because then it can become very chaotic. Can I see the reference book you had? We have to ask Marina, but I'm sure you will be able to access the slides. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.